You're tuned to The Voice of Russia. I'm Hywel Davies, and today we're discussing doping in sport. The afterglow of London's triumphant Olympic Games is only now fading away. It was a Games marked by heroic sporting achievement, and remarkably few of them were tainted by worries that athletes might be taking performance-enhancing drugs. But any complacency the sporting world may have felt has been stripped away by the US anti-doping agency and the comprehensive dossier it released on Lance Armstrong. It provided details of drugs taken, teammates corrupted, and officials hoodwinked as the American cyclist rode to 7 victories in the Tour de France, all without publicly failing a drugs test. So is sport getting on top of the trade in banned substances, or will some athletes always seek an advantage? And is doping necessarily a bad thing? I'm joined now here in the studio by Andy Parkinson, Chief Executive of UK Anti-Doping, the main agency fighting drugs in sport here in the UK. Tim Rolls, sports blogger. You can find him on plainsofalmeria.co.uk. Dan Travis, a sports coach and writer. And down the line from Oxford, we have Julian Savulescu. He's director of the Uehiro Centre for Practical Ethics at the University of Oxford. If I can start with you, Andy, do you think that this Lance Armstrong case marks a sea change in how we think about doping in sport?
Yeah, I think it does. One of the significant points around it is, as you mentioned, is that it hasn't come as a result of a positive test. And it's something we've been talking about a lot over the last probably 4 or 5 years, and the influence and the ability of anti-doping agencies to use intelligence and to use eyewitness statements to get to the bottom of doping. And this is obviously a very clear illustration of how that can be conducted in a proper and effective manner.
But isn't it also illustrative of how the people who have been charged with fighting doping have actually been failing over the last few years, in that he, as I said, he didn't fail a drugs test that we publicly know about anyway?
There's some arguments to that, but we've got to bear in mind that a lot of the evidence put forward in the USADA decision was from up to 10 years ago, and anti-doping has moved forward dramatically since then. In the UK, we've now got strong links with law enforcement agencies. The UCI has a biological passport program in place and has done for 3 or 4 years now. And while we are not certainly in the position where we can say we can tackle doping successfully, we're much better at it than we were in the time when this Armstrong case is being documented.
Tim, you've actually called for very strict penalties against people who dope, life bans, in fact.
Yeah, I mean, I think from where I sit, you know, taking the fans' perspective, if you like, basically I think you've got a situation where some people are cheating and some people are not. And I think if you want a level playing field, then you have to aim towards having only people who are completely clean, who haven't been taking drugs. And I think those that are caught should be banned. And I think where it's systemic within the team, as it was in the case of Armstrong, then the senior people involved in running the team should be banned as well.
Julian, if I turn to you, isn't that the problem, is that some people take drugs and some don't, and therefore the ones who don't are at a huge disadvantage?
And the problem is, I don't think you'll be able to eradicate this, even with very stiff penalties. There aren't effective tests for blood doping, and as you said, Armstrong was never picked up on a failed test. People just change their behaviour, so we should relook at exactly what we do ban and what we don't ban. All of the discussion around blood doping and EPO could be eradicated by just changing the rules to allow people to dope up to a very safe level of 50%, and then you wouldn't need to test for at least that range of doping practices. And indeed, the honest athletes could participate on a level playing field with regard to that agent.
So you also, I think, have worries about the medical effects of unregulated doping?
Yeah, the pressure today is not to get caught. It's not. There's no pressure to develop safe doping agents. If you allowed an open market, there would be an incentive to develop agents that are safe enough to be allowed, that would compete with inevitably agents on the black market, which are riskier. But at the moment, there's no way in which an honest athlete can participate by taking substances safely.
Back to Andy for a second. How do you cope with that criticism? Unregulated doping is actually dangerous for some athletes.
Yeah, I don't disagree with what Julian said in terms of the black market. That's a big concern for us. If you look at the availability of substances on the internet at the moment, they're phenomenal. And you've got young kids, young athletes potentially buying substances in a very discreet, confidential way, and they don't know what they're buying, and that in itself is extremely dangerous. I suppose where I fundamentally disagree with the sort of regulated concept of doping is for young kids. if you're an elite athlete with good support networks around you, with good medics, potentially that model could work. But we know that most people who play sport don't have that. And we know that the risks of taking substances like EPO, like blood doping, can have significantly harmful effects. And what we don't want, personally, and I know the sports sector in the UK doesn't want, is an acknowledgement that sport is anything but a healthy activity that the general population should be engaged in.
And Dan, you seem to be a halfway house. You've called for some penalties against people who take drugs, but not these lifetime bans.
I wouldn't say I was the halfway house. I mean, my position is quite clear. The reason we have drug scandals is because the drugs themselves are banned. If they're not banned, they're not illegal, and therefore no one's cheating. So I definitely agree with Julian on that level. However, I think there is. I think it's far less problematic than Julian's making out. It's not a question of health alone that we should allow for certain performance-enhancing drugs. My example is the fact that there is no drug that is actually a performance enhancer. It's not been proved. There is no evidence for any drug that can turn an athlete into a top international athlete from.
But we have women's records that have not been.
Can I just finish the point? There is yes, there is a correlation. There may be a correlation between the two, but there is certainly no hard evidence between taking drugs, so-called performance enhancers, and an improvement in performance. Secondly, and I think just as importantly, even if there is a performance-enhancing drug that can elevate performance in the way that the way it is claimed at the moment, even given that, the performance-enhancing drugs, what I would call internal technology, would take, I'd say, 8th, maybe 9th place in relation to other performance enhancers, such as, well, location, wealth, and also modern training facilities and coaching. All of those would, I would assert that all of those would supersede any so-called performance enhancing drugs. My third point, I'll make this very quick. My third point is that even if we do have, even if performance enhancing drugs can improve performance, and I just add a caveat to that, just note that there is no drug scandals at Wimbledon, or in any football has never been found guilty of a so-called performance-enhancing drug. Right, it's only in very, very specific sports where it's a problem. Athletics being one example. Even if performance-enhancing drugs can improve performance, then I still would assert that they should be made legal. Yes, there may be problems. There may be certain health problems too. However, we have to end the hypocrisy, I think, and make it a level playing field.
We have times now, currently on the Tour de France, for example, where people talk about this year being slower. Doesn't that indicate that people who were on drugs a few years ago, they were quicker? That would indicate that drugs do work.
I think that's a mistake. The average speed was
Julian,
higher.
yeah.
Some of the hill events were slower, but that could be because of the composition of the classification. I mean, in all of cycling, the speeds have relentlessly gone up, and so you have to ask, how is it that people can achieve those if they're not doping today? And indeed, why did they dope in the first place if they can go faster today?
Andy, if I might come to you on this, the idea that the doping doesn't work, what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I'm quite obviously going to disagree with that. I mean, I think we've certainly spoken to a number of athletes who've been banned and have spoken to us. And I think, again, going back to the Lance Armstrong case, this is a real step change in athletes actually coming forward and talking to us. They say quite categorically that their performance was enhanced. I think the point that's being made is that, yes, there are a number of variables that determine elite performance, and, wealth of a country, whether you live at altitude or otherwise, certainly are factors in that. I suppose fundamentally what the sport movement has said through the World Anti-Doping Agency is they don't see that taking drugs is compatible with what people want and expect from elite performance or even participation performance. And that is reflected in the way that the list is created, the banned list, which does have a caveat in there around performance enhancing, but also health of the athlete and making sure that drugs are on the list because they contravene the spirit of sport. So I think certainly what I don't want as a parent is I don't want my kid taking drugs to compete in sport. That's the bottom line. And I think that even goes as far as to say you go into the supermarket these days and you see tubs of creatine. There's a whole supplement industry out there which can't be healthy for our young kids or our young people to participate in sport.
You're tuned to The Voice of Russia. I'm Hywel Davies, and today we're discussing doping in sport. I'm joined here in the studio by Andy Parkinson, Chief Executive of UK Anti-Doping, Tim Rolls, a sports blogger, Dan Travis, a sports coach and writer, and down the line from Oxford we have Julian Savulescu. He's Director at the Uehiro Centre for Practical Ethics at the University of Oxford. Sorry, Tim.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've got a son who rose at university. He's quite good. He's not sort of ever going to be world class, but he's quite good. And he's quite clear, and his coach is quite clear, that they will not take drugs. They will take supplements, as you say, and even I'm slightly uncomfortable about things you can buy in health food shops, for example. But I certainly wouldn't want to get a situation where he became a, if you like, better athlete by taking performance-enhancing drugs. I'd far rather he achieved what he can achieve naturally. And I think that there's I think the public in large are pretty horrified by the drug taking. The Armstrong story certainly has become a major story, and I just think that from a public perspective, from a fan's perspective like myself, people would rather that athletes are on the level playing field, and that involves taking no performance enhancing drugs at all.
Dan did raise an interesting point. Do you worry that sports like football, for example, are not testing properly?
I mean, I think that there's interesting, Dan makes the point well, that possibly with sports like football, there aren't any drugs that would improve performance. I mean, the only people that have been caught have been taking recreational drugs, which certainly would not be performance enhancing, cannabis or cocaine. Don't think anybody thinks that they would improve performance. And I think with sports maybe like cricket and rugby, it's less likely. It is certain sports. I mean, I remember when I was very young, Tommy Simpson was a cyclist. He died in Tour de France, and I was 10. And I was horrified when it came out that he was taking, I think it was amphetamines and drinking whiskey, which is obviously very, primitive compared with what's been happening recently with Armstrong. But it's still, I think it horrifies the public at large.
I think time will show that doping is rife in football. It just hasn't been picked up so far. Zinedine Zidane described going to a Swiss clinic for a blood rejuvenation therapy. And Oscar Ferrero, the cyclist, named a number of Spanish football players who have been doping. And when it takes a fraction of the second to get to the ball quicker than the opponent at the end of the match to score a goal, of course people will be blood doping. And it's just the fact that it hasn't been patrolled as aggressively as in cycling. There
are some sports, Dan, that seems fairly obvious that doping might help you. Rugby, for example, building muscle. I would have thought that would be a sport that we might...
Also, don't forget we're using this as in a quite a pejorative sense in the first place. By using the term doping, we're already assuming that it's wrong in the first place. One of the reasons athletes will take the so-called performance-enhancing drugs, certainly the steroids being one of them, is to repair muscle and to prevent and shorten injury and prolong their career. And I argue that is a good reason for doing it.
Andy, we seem to be implying that there may be some sports that are not doing enough to police themselves.
I mean, I think Julian's point about football is a good one, because this day and age, elite footballers play a game every three days. They run on average of 10 to 16 kilometres a game. There is enormous pressure on them from club, sponsor, fans to deliver performances on a regular basis. To suggest that there's no doping in football is naive. I certainly think that from an international level, there needs to be a recognition that we can do more, much more. And I mean, the real advent over the last decade has been the institution of the World Anti-Doping Agency and the way we tackle it. But certainly from our perspective, we run a regular annual risk assessment of which sports we think are of higher risk of athletes may dope. We look at the substances that are available to them, what benefit they might get, and then we address each sport in a slightly different way. I mean, to put it bluntly, tiddlywinks is going to be far less risky at doping than say, cycling. So we try to do it on a risk-based assessment. But I think also what we would say is that just because you don't have evidence of positive tests doesn't firstly mean that you don't have a doping problem, and secondly, it also doesn't mean that you might not have a doping problem in the future. And the availability of substances, as I mentioned, is quite outstanding, and we need to keep protecting our vulnerable athletes.
I was speaking to a cycling journalist yesterday, and he was saying, well, look, we've got the best anti-doping controls of all, and that's why we keep catching people the whole time. Do you think there's some validity in that?
Well, I think probably what the UCI needs to recognise, if it hasn't done already, is it might have the greatest testing programme in the world, but there are many other tools that it needs to invest in. That is, links with law enforcement agencies, trying to tackle the supply, trying to talk to sponsors and manage people's expectation. And let's face it, half of the guys on the Tour de France, they're pretty young adults who are being asked to perform extreme sporting activity for a variety of reasons. You've got sponsors that are making an awful lot of money out of the Tour de France, and that needs to be reflected. I think you've only got to speak to someone like David Miller and understand the decision to dope is not a simple one. No rider wakes up in the morning and says, do you know what, I'm going to be a doping athlete today.
Julian, do you get this feeling that sort of we have lots of athletes who are being exploited, and perhaps that's why they fall into the trap or non-trap, as you might say it, of doping?
Well, I don't know that I'd say exploited. I mean, one athlete said, if you don't dope, you don't win, and if you don't win, the sponsors don't support you the next year. I mean, I think it's important to remember that the USADA report pointed out that 20 out of 21 podium finishes between 1999 and 2005 were implicated in doping. But that hasn't changed much. It's still 36 out of 45 in the years since then. So the fact is that the prize money and the fame provide such a pressure to win that inevitably people will use substances that give them some edge. So it just makes sense to try to reduce harm instead of to try to absolutely ban it and have a zero tolerance. I mean, we've done this already with caffeine. People used to be expelled, have their medals taken away from them for taking caffeine. Caffeine increases the time to exhaustion by 10 to 15%. It's now off the WADA banned list, and it hasn't changed athletics or cycling, and people now take caffeine because it's safe enough. We could do that with other drugs, but it's just that we're fixated with this idea of attempting to entirely eradicate them, and it's just not going to work. It would be lovely if it did, but it's just not the real world.
Sorry, Tim was wanting to come in there.
Yeah, just quickly on caffeine, it's interesting because the England game in Poland was postponed 24 hours, and it turns out most of the England team had been taking Pro-Plus tablets, which are caffeine.
It didn't really work very well, did it?
And it didn't. And because the game was called off, they had to take sleeping tablets. And there's an article in the Guardian this morning saying that's not a healthy thing to do, and no wonder they were pretty jaded during the game. So I think even caffeine has got its limitations.
Sorry, Andy, you were trying to come in.
What Julian's saying is that, in actual fact, what we want is the banned list to be smaller or more regulated. I'm not trying to put words into your mouth, Julian.
No, that's exactly it.
And I mean, certainly that's something that we as a national anti-doping organisation are advocating for, because what we want is for national anti-doping organisations to be tackling the real performance enhancers that have a potential negative health consequence.
So do you think there's too much on the list now?
Yeah, I mean, certainly what we've been talking about with the World Anti-Doping Agency is how do we get a list that reflects the threat of doping and the threat of fraud to the general public and the threat of a health consequence to athletes with what in essence is a pretty limited anti-doping resource worldwide. And that is really the nub of it. The extreme of that is the sleeping pills and the caffeine, because is that something that we want to see on the back pages of the papers, or are we prepared to accept that? And do you know what? People are going to have varying differences of opinion.
Why don't you accept just allowing blood doping up to a hematocrit of 50%? That'd be safe, and you wouldn't have to test for EPO or blood doping.
Do you know, there's one simple reason why I wouldn't advocate that. I would never want my son to be taking out blood and putting it back into him so that he...
children and allow it in adults. That's what we do with alcohol. I mean, you can focus on eradicating it from children.
Well, sorry, Dan was trying to come in here.
Andy, I think you make a very interesting point for me here, that actually you would like to reduce the list. The role of an anti-doping agency should be to actually monitor safety, right, rather than moral kind of policing of cheating. I think that we need to make a very clear distinction between the two, because at the moment I think sport is being discredited because of drug scandals that are over actual moral or cheating issues, right? And those that actually pose a threat to the individual athlete. I don't know. I'm not an authority on blood transfusions and the EPO issue. My guess, however, is that blood transfusions are a threat to the individual health of the athlete. Don't do it. It should be banned. I want to be clear on that.
So we're making a distinction.
Steroid use, however, is not. Okay? Now, that's a moral question, and it's to do with cheating. I think we've confused the two, and we should, I think, be sticking to discussing banning substances that are an immediate threat to the individual who takes them.
Yeah, I think what's important to recognise is that governments play a significant part in the anti-doping fight. So if you look at the World Anti-Doping Agency model, you've got sport in an equal partnership with government. Now, we're an agency that's funded by government, and government has a public health interest in the broader society agenda, and as a result we get significant support for what we do because it has a public health impact. Equally, when you look at the sports sector, what the sports sector is extremely interested in is getting rid of fraudulent performances, which we've talked about here on the Tour de France. So I don't think it's as simple. I don't think you can say this part doesn't matter, this part does matter. But I think what WADA is trying to do at the moment is construct a list that satisfies both the public health agenda and also the desire from sport to see as much of a level playing field as is possible, recognising the level playing field in its definition is entirely impossible to achieve.
You're tuned to The Voice of Russia. I'm Hywel Davies, and today we're discussing doping in sport. I'm joined here in the studio by Andy Parkinson, Chief Executive of UK Anti-Doping, Tim Rolls, a sports blogger, Dan Travis, a sports coach and writer, and down the line from Oxford we have Julian Savulescu. He's Director at the Uehiro Centre for Practical Ethics at the University of Oxford. So Tim, as a sports fan, you presumably are, the level playing field is what you're after.
Absolutely,
really.
I think so. I think it'd be good if the public, the viewing public, whether they're at events or watching on television or reading about it in the media, that they felt that there was a level playing field and that everyone was competing equally. I think the problem comes when it's felt that it's discovered that people aren't, and then people lose interest in sport. I think, some of the scandals we've had over the last 20 or 30 years have turned people off watching sport because they don't believe it's fair.
You don't think people have got used to it now? They're saying, look, there's every Olympic Games, there's a scandal.
They may get used to it, but it doesn't mean that they accept it. I mean, or that they acknowledge or welcome it.
Julian, at Oxford, we also have, of course, on the horizon the idea of genetic modification of athletes. That's just going to make things even more complicated.
Yeah, well, that's going to be very difficult to detect. You'll have to do muscle biopsies if people have that kind of therapy. That is going to be much riskier and probably where WADA should be, devoting its attention. But they're going to have to completely rethink how they tackle that kind of problem. And I think it's exactly right. You've got limited resources, and you've got to work out what are the really serious issues that are changing the nature of sport or really dangerous to health. But it's just false that allowing blood transfusions and blood doping up to a hematocrit of 50% is unsafe. I mean, you can achieve that through using a hypoxic air tent, a machine to lower your oxygen. So, you should focus on the really important goals and focus on children if that's the main concern. Try to prevent the use. But kids are going to realise, if they're at the elite levels of sport today, that if you take banned doping agents, you're going to get an advantage. And if you're really at the level that you're going to make a career and spend the rest of your life doing this, the pressure's already there to take those substances. So I don't think that relaxing the controls on adults is going to somehow cause an epidemic of doping in children.
But isn't the story of Lance Armstrong is that you might take drugs for a long time, but you'll still end up disgraced?
Yeah, but there's probably many more people who don't end up disgraced. As I just said, that most of the people in cycling have been implicated in doping, and it's going to be interesting what happens with the UCI, whether they do strip Armstrong of his medals. And I think the only thing that's stopping Armstrong doing what Landis did and blowing the whole can apart is the threat of criminal prosecutions in the US. But, it would be very interesting if he actually said what was going on in cycling. And I think then we'd have to face the hypocrisy that we've been living under for so many years and really get down to deciding what our enforceable rules should be.
Julian, you make a good point, because I agree with you, because really what we've seen through the Armstrong case, and probably more recently in the Marion Jones case as well, is where law enforcement and sport can work closely together. Then you can get some sort of punishment that does actually...
A punishment that actually scares athletes, potential
sends
athletes.
a strong message. I mean, to be fair, the greatest punishment for an athlete is to be called a cheat.
I suspect time in state prisoners, and Jones has had as a bit of a more.
Maybe that's true, but certainly that's the first deterrent. And we talked a little bit about lifetime bans earlier on. I mean, the sanctioning regime has to be proportionate, and to bring law enforcement into it, I think starts to provide some good, strong messaging in terms of behaviour, or what's expected around sports, and whether or not we like the list or not, there's always going to be difference of opinions about what should be on it.
Dan, do you think we're being slightly hypocritical here in that we're putting all this pressure on athletes to perform, and then when they step out of off the straight and narrow, we get, woof, let's put you in prison?
I think what we've got a case of here is concerns in wider society, drug taking being probably a prime case, are being projected onto sport, and it falls to sport where our morality and battles of conscience are played out. That's why we have had the drug scandals. It almost bears the brunt of concerns about children and drug taking, etc. Simply because I think in wider society we've kind of lost our way. We've lost our way politically. Certainly, there's a certain amount of fear around economically. Education seems to not know where it's going either, and sport provides this kind of very black and white, almost fairy tale land where we can reenact these morality fairy tales again and again. So we have the example of Lance Armstrong. Let's come back to him. Throughout the weekend, and I've got the Times here. You know, he's not just accused of being a cheat. He's accused of being a womanizer, of treating women badly, etc., etc., of corruption, and on and so on and so on and so on. So the morality play here.
We should stress perhaps these are allegations rather than.
Yes.
Else, yeah.
Yes, they are. But you can see here the whole moral bandwagon going with the media going on with Lance, and it's almost like a direct correlation between wider concerns in wider society and sport.
Sorry, we're running out of time. I might just give the last word to Tim as our sort of representative of the sport watching public.
Well, I mean, just from my point of view, I mean, I hear what people are saying. It's very interesting to look at particular cases. And I think it'd be interesting if Armstrong was British and not American, what the media would have been if he'd been such a hero in the country for the last 10 years. But I mean, my stance is clear that, it should be zero tolerance, and then you take it from there, and then you deal with transgressors accordingly.
Well, I'm sorry, that's all we have time for. So thank you to all my guests. Andy Parkinson, Chief Executive of UK Anti-Doping, Tim Rolls, sports blogger, Dan Travis, a sports coach and writer, and down the line from Oxford, Julian Savulescu, who is at Oxford University. Thank you all very much for taking part.